I walked into that courtroom completely alone. No lawyer beside me. No family in my corner. Just me, a single folder under my arm, and my mother-in-law sitting in the front row with a smile stretched across her face like she'd already won. She leaned over to her sister and whispered just loud enough for me to hear.
Watch.
She won't last 5 minutes. I didn't answer. I just sat down at the empty table on my side of the room and opened my folder. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that for 11 years, I stood in rooms exactly like this one. Except back then, I wasn't the woman on trial. I was the one asking the questions. I was the one who put people away. She was about to find out the hard way. My name is Colonel Elaine Bennett. Well, it used to be Colonel. These days, most people just know me as David's wife, or the kid's mom. When I met David, I had already left active duty. I'd spent over a decade as a military prosecutor, handling cases most people never hear about, cases involving fraud, abuse of command, cover-ups that could destroy careers and lives. I closed that chapter when our first daughter was born. I wanted quiet. I wanted normal. So I never brought it up. Not to neighbors. Not to friends. And definitely not to David's mother, Carol. From the very first dinner, Carol decided who I was. In her eyes, I was a woman who had given up on ambition. "It's a shame," she told David once, right in front of me, "that you married someone with no real career." She said it the way you'd comment on the weather. Simple fact, no need to soften it. I let it go. Year after year, I let it go. She called me sweet but simple. She told her friends I used to work in an office. Nothing important. Every holiday, every birthday, she found a new way to remind me that in her mind, I was less than her son. David used to apologize for her behind closed doors. "She doesn't mean it," he'd say. I stopped believing that a long time ago. She meant every word. Everything changed the year David's father passed away. He left behind a modest but meaningful estate, the family lake house, some savings, and a small trust meant for his grandchildren's education. David, being an only child, expected it to pass to him and then to our kids without any issue. Carol had other plans. She quietly hired a lawyer and filed a claim arguing that David and I were financially unstable and unfit to manage the trust responsibly. She wanted full control transferred to her, cutting David out entirely as an unreliable trustee, and by extension, cutting me and our daughters out too. When David got the legal notice, his hands were shaking. "She's really doing this," he kept repeating. "Her own son." We tried to talk to her first. I sat across from Carol at her kitchen table and asked her, calmly, to reconsider. She looked at me and said the words that would replay in my head for weeks. "This isn't about you, Elaine. This is a legal matter. You wouldn't understand these things." I understood far more than she could have imagined. David wanted to hire our own attorney immediately, but Carol's lawyer had already filed for an expedited hearing, and finding proper representation on such short notice was proving impossible. Every family law attorney we called was either booked solid or wanted a retainer we didn't have on hand that week. Then, 3 days before the hearing, David was called out of state for an emergency at work, a project deadline he couldn't push back without risking his job. He begged me to postpone. "We can't postpone," I told him. "The judge already set the date." "Then what do we do?" he asked, panic in his voice. I looked at him and said something that surprised even me. "I'll go. I'll handle it." He blinked. "Elaine, you're not a lawyer." I paused for a long moment. Then I said quietly, "Actually, David, there's something I never told you." There wasn't time to explain everything. I just told him enough, that I used to build cases for a living, that I knew courtrooms better than he realized. He left for his trip still confused, still worried. Carol, when she heard I was showing up on my own, couldn't hide her delight. "Good," she told her sister on the phone, not realizing I was in the next room. "Let her go in there and embarrass herself. Maybe then David will finally see reason." I didn't spend those 3 days panicking. I spent them working. I pulled every financial document Carol's lawyer had filed. I read through the claim line by line, searching for the cracks. And I found them. Carol's petition leaned heavily on one document, A private financial statement she claimed proved David and I were drowning in debt. There was just one problem. The numbers didn't add up. The account listed as overdrawn wasn't even one of ours. It belonged to David's cousin, who shared a similar name. Carol's lawyer had made a sloppy mistake, and Carol, in her rush to win, had signed off on it without checking. I also requested the original trust documents from the courthouse archive. Reading through them, I noticed something else. Carol's petition ignored a clause explicitly naming David as sole trustee upon his father's passing, with no conditions attached. Her legal argument wasn't just weak. It was built on sand. I organized everything into a single folder. No dramatic speeches planned. No emotional outbursts. Just facts, in order, ready to be laid on the table one by one. The night before the hearing, I sat at my kitchen table and felt something I hadn't felt in years. That same steady calm I used to feel before walking into a courtroom back when it was my job to seek the truth. The courtroom that morning was smaller than I remembered courtrooms being, but it still carried that same weight in the air. Carol sat in the front row with her lawyer, practically glowing with confidence. When I walked in alone, she let out a short laugh and murmured to her sister, "You're finished." Then the judge walked in, and everything changed. He glanced down at his docket, then looked up at me, studying my face for a moment. A flicker of recognition crossed his expression. He straightened in his chair. "Good morning, Colonel Bennett," he said. "It's been a long time." The room went silent. Carol's smile froze halfway on her face. It turned out this particular judge had once served as a military defense attorney early in his career, and years ago, in a different courtroom, in a different uniform, I had been the prosecutor on the opposing side of one of his toughest cases. He remembered me well. Not because I lost. Because I never once cut a corner, even when it would have made things easier. "You two know each other?" Carol's lawyer asked, visibly rattled. "We do," the judge replied simply. "Please proceed." I stood up, opened my folder, and began laying out the truth, point by point, document by document. I showed the mismatched financial statement. I read the trustee clause Carol's petition had conveniently overlooked. I stayed calm, precise, unshaken, the exact way I had trained myself to be for 11 years. Carol's lawyer stumbled through a response, but the damage was already done. The judge dismissed her claim within the hour, ruling that the trust would remain exactly as David's father intended, with David as sole trustee, and our daughter's education fully protected. As we left the courthouse, Carol grabbed my arm. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" she asked, her voice shaking, no longer sharp with superiority. "You never asked," I said gently. "You just assumed." David came home 2 days later to find out everything from me directly, sitting at our kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold between us. I told him the whole story, my years in uniform, the cases I had prosecuted, the reason I had quietly closed that chapter of my life when we started our family. He was stunned, but not upset. If anything, he looked at me with a kind of pride I hadn't seen from him in years. "All this time," he said softly, "I thought I knew everything about you." "You knew the parts that mattered," I told him. "The rest just wasn't something I needed anyone to see." Carol changed after that day. Not overnight and not completely, old habits take time to unlearn. But she stopped introducing me as just David's wife. At the next family dinner, she actually asked me questions about my old work, listening quietly as I answered. It wasn't an apology, but it was respect, finally, and that was enough. For years, I let people define me by what they assumed instead of what I had actually lived. I let silence become invisibility. But that day in court taught me something important. You don't need to announce your worth to everyone around you. Sometimes the quietest people in the room have carried the heaviest responsibilities, faced the hardest battles, and simply chose not to make it anyone else's business. Don't mistake someone's silence for emptiness. And if you're the one who's been underestimated, by family, by strangers, by anyone, remember this. You don't owe anyone a resume of your worth. Sometimes the truth reveals itself exactly when it needs to. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who's ever been underestimated by their own family.